So evidence for evolution. Now, this Junopod, this is chapter 16, section 4. And I like to start off with a timeline that is not in the textbook. If we were in the classroom, I actually have a piece of string that I string across the room that has little marks for a lot of these items on it, so that I can show you. But I want to start at the bottom and work our way up. So BYA means billion years ago, MYA million years ago, TYA 1,000 years ago. So we think the universe formed 13.8 billion years ago, right? And I don't know if you remember me saying in class that when I was a kid, they thought the universe was 6 billion years old when I was in high school. So it's getting dramatically older during my lifetime as we do more science. The solar system, right? So the planet Earth was formed about 4.5 billion years ago. Allison, I can hear your sandwich. You have a mute button? Thank you. It's always lunchtime. So the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. The first living thing appeared pretty shortly after the Earth cooled down, and that was bacteria 3 billion years ago. That's a long time ago, right? And then after another billion years, a photosynthetic bacteria appeared, right? 2 billion years ago. And there's some debate about what is multicellular life and what's not. But some people say that multicellular life is colonies of single-celled things. But the actual thing that had several cells that specialized and did different stuff was about 1 billion years ago. And then you get worms in the sea 600 million years ago. Jawless fishes, those are the most ancient of the fishes. Then insects, amphibians and reptiles, birds, dinosaurs, and little mammals, right? Monkeys and apes here at 40 million years ago. People like us, or organisms that we think are part of our branch 6 million years ago. Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, what used to be called the missing link, 3 million years ago. And now we jump to thousands of years ago, right? So Neanderthals in the caves of Europe, a 250,000 years ago, 250,000 years ago. Then Homo sapiens, our people, 100,000 years ago. So if you think about 4.5 billion year old Earth, or 3 billion year ago bacteria, going up here to Homo sapiens appearing, it's like an enormous line, and Homo sapiens happened right here at the very end, right, in modern times. It's just, if this was a string that was 20 feet long, like I use in the classroom, it would be the last fringes of the string on the far right-hand side. So we're really recent, is the point, compared to what we see in the fossil record going back 3 billion years. Right, writing, right, about 5,000 years ago, when the first civilizations really started to flourish in Mesopotamia. And then the Trojan War, the first really written record of something we have, took place, we think, about 3,000 years ago. Democracy, 2,600 years, 500 years ago in Athens. My favorite philosopher, Aristotle, 2,400 years ago. So human history, our study of this prior existing time, right, going back to 3 billion years, we're really just at the very end of that. It's very recent. In general, there are 7 items usually used in talking about evidence for evolutionary theory. The first is biogeography. That's biology and geography together, obviously. And that's, where are the organisms now? Where did their ancestors live? So there's divergent evolution, evolution where things become more different. They split apart. And this would be, the best example of this would be, for example, Darwin's finches, we think started as one species, and then based on their food became different species that can no longer mate and have offspring. And the food was what island they were on. Or the tortoises, the ones with necks that allowed them to go down and eat things off the ground versus the ones with the really long necks for reaching up and grabbing things off the bottoms of small trees or shrubs or things like that. So one species that diverged is used as evidence for evolution. And then converge, meaning to come together. This is similar habitats can give rise to similar organisms that, and we think they arose because of their environment. So in Australia, we see animals similar to those that we have here, but also very different ones. And marsupial and placental mammals, they split off a long time ago back in history, but they arose and they ended up similar based on environments, with some exceptions like koala bears, right? And kangaroos and wallabies. So these environments, so one example of this oftentimes is that there are flightless birds. There's ostriches and rheas and emus, and they're found on different continents, but they all live in similar environments. So the thinking is that they adapted to the environment and developed those features of being large and fast and strong. So the second big one is the fossil record. The next is homologous structures or similar structures. Vestigial structures or vestiges, ancient things that are left over in organisms. Then embryological developmental similarities, like as embryos develop, they start out looking very similar to one another and then they differentiate. A molecular biology, and then visible evolution, evolution we can see, like the work that the Grants were doing on Daphne Major. That was the last homework assignment. Now, you see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these say from a common ancestor. Remember, for Darwin, that was one of the big things, right? That species change over time and descend from a common ancestor. All these are used as proof of descent from a common ancestor, to show that organisms are related to one another. Actual evolutionary, right, stuff that isn't just descent from a common ancestor would be biogeography and visible evolution, which we'll get to at the end here. My next slide is not going. There we go. I just jumped 3 pages. That was not the plan. All right, so page 3. Fossil locations are used as evidence for evolution. Have you guys heard of Pangea?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pangea, you might have learned it in earth science class.
Yeah.
So it's the idea that because of plate tectonics, the earth crust being made up of different plates, that the shape of the planet's continents has changed over years. And Pangea is the name for the most recent supercontinent, where all the land masses were smushed together and then separated because the magma underneath the earth moves and causes the continental plates to move. And remember, this is how mountains get made, when plates come together and push up, or it's how the trench gets made in the bottom of the ocean. I think that's called subduction, where one plate slides underneath the other. That's why California is really unstable, because the plates are meeting and going like this, and they catch, and then they pop loose, and then they catch, and then they pop loose every, X number of years. So fossil locations can be explained through plate tectonics. So this is kind of cool. South America and Africa fit into each other this way, right? Like a jigsaw puzzle. And the fossils of extinct animals are found in these narrow bands. So they're showing us here different reptiles and plants, and how you can find them if you look right where the continents used to fit together. And so actually the fact that these fossils were here and here was used as evidence for plate tectonics. Plate tectonic theory came later than Darwinian evolutionary theory, right? It was really like 1915 or so that theory came to be commonly accepted. So Pangaea is the most recent supercontinent, but before that, Columbia was the evidence we have points to that being the first one. Then a continent called Rodinia, and then before that, a combined group of land masses. My favorite name is Gondwana land here. I think it's kind of catchy. When I was a kid in the 1970s in Tacoma Park in Silver Spring, where we lived at the time, there was a bumper sticker that some cars had that said, "Reunite Gondwana land," as though it was a political problem. So it's one of those nerdy things that cracked me up as a kid. So homologous structures, similar structures, are things that are used as evidence for evolution. So here you've got the arms or wings of a human, a lizard, a cat, a whale, a bat, a frog, and a bird. Notice almost all of these are mammals except for the bird. There's one fish that sometimes makes it onto this list. It's a really ancient lobe-finned fish, like a coelacanth. And it has, but I couldn't find a picture that had that on it. But all these, the uncolored bone here is the humerus, right? Like this bone in you, right? The funny bone. And then a radius and an ulna, right? In the arm here, 2 bones. And these bones allow some movement rotation wise, right? So that, it lets a bat and bird adjust their wings. And then you've got carpals, which are wrist bones, the gray bones here in this picture. And then phalanges, right, which are the finger bones, which start for us right here above the carpals, and then they run all the way up. So your finger bones go all the way down to your wrist. And they're attached by tendons, right? So your tendons, remember we looked at in class, the tendons that curl the pinky, right, they run all the way down the arm here. So what does this tell us? This tells us that all these creatures probably descended from a common ancestor. If you are a creationist, it could also tell us that God came up with a good plan for animals that wanted to use their limbs in these ways, and we see variations of that plan throughout history in evolution. I'm going to try to just click that once and see if the screen moves forward. It didn't move. There we go. No, we jumped. Oh, vestigial structures. So vestiges are ancient things, remnants, things that are left over, right? Like the vestiges of our life in the classroom, the remnants. So some examples that are commonly used are flightless birds, right? Why do ostriches have wings unless they descended from something that flew once? Tailbones in people. Right? Why do we have them? Is it just to break them? They don't have a lot of muscles attached to them. But we think we descended from things that had tails. Hind legs on some snakes, especially bigger snakes like pythons, are still visible in many cases. Hip bones in whales. Right? The theory is that whales were mammals that left the land and went into the ocean at a time when in their environment sea levels were high. So they evolved to do that over time, and some of them retained their hip bones, which we have not found a use for. And then the erector pili muscle in humans. I have some pictures here now. So this is the underside of a snake, a boa constrictor, and they're showing us the hind legs here poking out. They look like teeth. Kind of gross. Hip bones in whales, right? You don't need hip bones unless you're going to have legs. So we see some evidence of fossils of whales, of whales' ancestors that had legs and could walk and swim. Think alligator-looking things, but mammals and larger is the idea. But these are pictures of different whales' hip bones. And I think these bones inside current whales aren't attached to the backbone. So they aren't, like for us, our vertebrae are attached to our hip bones. For current whales, these just sit inside the whale in a place where there are no other bones attached to them. So thought to be vestiges. This is one of my favorites. I think I tried to draw a picture of this for you in class. So goosebumps, right? We get goosebump responses when we're cold or sometimes when we're scared. Right? That's why that children's book series was called Goosebumps, R.L. Stein. So if you scare somebody, you can trigger a goosebump reaction. So your brain is aware of a problem. It releases hormones that cause the goosebump reaction. And what goosebumps are is this little red strip right here is a tiny muscle. It's attached to the bottom of every hair shaft. And when a hair is lying down flat, right, that means that it's pointing this way. But when the muscle contracts, it lifts the muscle, right? So if the hair is normally lying this way, yeah, can I do it? Let's see on the screen so that you can see it. So if the hair is lying this way and the muscle contracts, it pulls the hair up. And this is not a useful response in people because we don't have enough fur or hair to take advantage of this. But if you were cold and you were a bear and you could get all your hairs to stand up, you create a layer of insulation. So the hairs on bears and the feathers on birds, the downy feathers underneath, they lock together and they create a little layer of air insulation. And that way, if the bear's body is down here or the duck, right, it just has to warm this little space where the hair is or between the feathers in order to avoid freezing to death. So in us, though, I mean, there's some very hairy human beings, but nobody with enough hair. Well, there's a genetic disorder in people's DNA that makes them excessively hairy. But maybe those people can take advantage of this evolutionary trick to have a little form of insulation to avoid freezing. Why this also plays a role in the fear scare reflex, I have no idea. I'm not sure if it's been studied. I'm gonna hit the button one more time for number 9. More evidence for evolution. Embryological, so the embryos of different organisms. A human, a chicken, a tortoise, a salamander, and a fish. So these are all really similar, as you can tell, right? The head starts to develop in the same way. There's this thing called the notochord that becomes the spinal cord that shows up at the same time in development, right? The organisms end up looking very similar. These are, sometimes they're called gill slits. They're also called pharyngeal slits. The pharynx is here, the voice box, right? So the way we develop indicates that we probably all came from one organism way back when. All these things that have development in the same way, or God made a plan, and one organism went from there. So these slits, these gill or pharyngeal slits, in some organisms they filter food from water. In others, like fish, they do oxygen exchange. In tadpoles, like baby frogs, they originally help those organisms get oxygen from water. And then the tadpole at one point starts using lungs. And these gill slits, I think, become part of the vocal box for the frogs, these gill slits. For us, these go away very early in development, in the first couple of months that we're developing in our mother's womb. And they start to turn into bones of the inner ear and part of the jaw structure. The cells differentiate, if you remember when we studied differentiation. So these similarities at the very start of an embryo are used as evidence for a common ancestor and therefore the idea of evolution. I got another slide here or two. There we go. Right. And this is kind of the big one that gets a lot of attention now, molecular biology. Right? Every living thing uses adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine in DNA to code for amino acids and to code for usually the same amino acids. And then they all use uracil and RNA to build the proteins from those amino acids that are needed to make cells, right? Life is based on cells, right? This is certainly evidence of descent from a common ancestor if we're going to apply logic and reason. And the more closely related we think organisms are, the closer together their DNA is. So insulin in humans and chimpanzees is the genes are 98% identical. Whereas humans and chickens, about 64% identical. But everybody uses insulin. This is an example, human and chimpanzee hemoglobin. There's one base pair. So one like nucleotide, an A, a T, or a G, or a C, out of 1,614 base pairs that's different. And when you get to other animals compared to people, there are more differences. So apes, you know, there are more differences. There are more differences than with apes. So that is some of the best evidence for descent from a common ancestor also. And then I think, oh yeah, so visible microevolutionary changes. So we can't watch macroevolution. We can just look for fossil evidence of it. But stuff we can see, really there are only three types. There's pesticide resistance in insects. Right? If we spray them, we kill the insects that are susceptible to the spray, the poison. Some develop immunity or resistance to it. They survive and then they flourish. Antibiotic resistance in bacteria is really the same mechanism. Right? We take an antibiotic, it kills most of the bacteria. Some of them evolve or have mutations that let them survive, and they keep going. They flourish. And then Darwin's finches, right? Animal studies like this, and the grants are the most famous example, right? But we could study as an environment changes because of weather, what changes in the organisms that live there, right? So were there more white moths before the Industrial Revolution in England or not, right? Seems reasonable to conclude that there were, but nobody did any well-validated experiments on that. We do know albino squirrels don't reproduce very much, right? Probably because they get eaten by hawks at a pretty good rate. You know, even squirrels, you know, squirrels tend to be the same color in one area. I have a mutant squirrel I've been trying to take a picture of in my yard. It's a black squirrel with a red tail. I've never seen anything like it. Yes, Allison?
We have a black squirrel with like a light brown tail. It's like the tail is albino.
Yeah, this one is light brownish, red looking to me. And I wonder if there's a genetic defect in, I've never seen a squirrel like this. I've seen a lot of squirrels growing up in this area, but never seen one like this. And I wonder if it's some recent genetic mutation that's being passed around the squirrel population that only affects the tails.